Hey everyone. In this episode, I talk once again to therapist and educator Wendy Morgan, and this time we're talking about boundaries. And oh, what a topic boundaries is. She looks at it through the therapist lens, and I look at it through the coaching perspective. And together we talk about how we might support our clients in different scenarios where they are trying to set and hold boundaries for themselves. And the most important part is that we talk about how boundaries are not for other people. They're actually just for ourselves. And the commitment that we make to setting and holding them is what really matters when it comes to our boundaries. So with that, I hope you enjoy the episode. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Zovig. Nice to see you again.
Yes, welcome back.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, so what we're talking about today is something that you've called sort of the bread and butter of your work as a therapist. And I think it is also the bread and butter of what I do in coaching, and that is boundaries.
Yeah.
Boundaries come up a lot. It may not come up directly as I'm struggling with my boundaries, but often when people share an issue, a challenge that they're having, a struggle, boundaries are at least in some part they contribute to the issue. And what I would love to do with you is talk a little bit about boundaries, how they look, et cetera. But I kind of want to share with listeners how you as a therapist look at boundaries and how I as a coach might look at boundaries. Because I said this in the last episode that we were together, that our work can often be parallel and very complementary. And so I'd love to just do that sort of side by side where it makes sense for us to do that. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I think that sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my first question to you is just sort of general. How do boundaries typically show up in your world as a therapist?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I really realize like boundaries really do become an integral part of the work that we do in the therapy space. It's kind of the bread and butter of what's happening. I think that they show up first when folks are coming in and recognizing that they feel like their boundaries have been breached, right? That that's often something that will bring an individual or couples to the therapy space, right? I'm trying to set boundaries, but they're not being respected. And that, for me, is where the biggest perspective shift has to come in. There is so much out in the world right now about boundaries everywhere you look, whether it's, TikTok or pop psychology. There's lots of talk going on about boundaries, and some of it is really, really helpful and important. But there are some occasions where that presentation of boundaries comes across in this performative kind of way, right? I'm going to draw a line in the sand, and if you cross it, something bad will happen. I will, the consequences will come. And I think we need to stop thinking about those as boundaries. Those are not boundaries. Those are named consequences. Boundaries are about the things that I do, not the things that you do. Boundaries
Say that again. Say that again, Wendy, because I think that's really important. Say that one more time.
Yeah. A boundary is something that I set for myself. It lives in me. My boundaries move with me. So a boundary is something that I do. It's not something that someone else breaches, right? Now, be clear, people disregard our requests for their behavior all the time, right? But that's not necessarily the same thing, right? Those can be different pieces. And there's actually something really that can be quite empowering when we allow ourselves to actually take control of our boundaries, because we then hold the power over the boundaries. It's not about, I've drawn the line in the sand and I'm kind of waiting for people to come and cross it, right? Boundaries move with me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really important distinction to make, that the boundaries are not something I'm putting on you. The boundary is there for me and by me. And when they are mine, I am in full control of them. And I know that, and this probably shows up for you too, like I've set a boundary. It shows up in coaching. I set the boundary. I told them no more of this, no more of that. We're not doing it this way. And then they just keep breaking it. And then I don't know what to do. And in those moments, I think a person can feel like they don't have as much agency as maybe they realize they do.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think you're right in that people do see it as you broke my rule. I set a rule and you broke my rule, versus how am I going to uphold the rule for myself, for my own good?
Mm-hmm. I like that phrasing, right? You broke my rule versus how do I uphold this rule for myself, right?
Yeah. And I think that boundaries are only as good as the degree to which we can hold them. I think of boundaries in many ways, and maybe you do too, but I think of boundaries as even, I set a certain schedule for myself to exercise. That is a boundary that I set for myself. I think of that as a boundary to a degree. If I'm constantly not following through on that commitment, I'm not holding my own boundary.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's the hardest part to do, is take accountability for our own boundaries and then do what we need to do to hold them, particularly in moments where we are not comfortable holding them. Can you share a little bit about that? Maybe the discomfort of holding our own boundaries?
Yes. Yeah. So something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, as a therapist who works with lots of middle-aged women, it's of course maybe not surprising that things that come up inside of the therapy room all the time are people pleasing and perfectionism. And that often goes hand in hand with folks who struggle to uphold their boundaries. So let's think about this way. If we struggle to hold that boundary, right? Maybe we fall off the wagon on the exercising. We don't often feel as good about ourselves. Or if we allow someone to interfere with our boundaries so that we have lost how we feel about ourselves, we have let them come into that space for us. Guilt can come on board, right? Yeah. We can start to feel guilt after we've tried to hold the boundary. And it's often connected to that. I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy to hold that boundary. My needs are not important enough to have boundaries around them.
I know it's a big question, so make the question smaller as you see fit, but how do you address that piece of it? My needs don't matter. My needs aren't as important. So how do you address that when you see that that's what's behind the continuous self-breaching of the boundaries?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, it so often depends on where the person is. And sometimes for some folks, it is enough to recognize that that's what's happening. And then they can start to get curious and question, oh, maybe when that guilt comes in, it's just because I'm over empathizing with the person who has left me feeling like this and under empathizing with myself, right? But sometimes you're working with folks where these patterns of behavior are so deeply seated that we have to do really baseline level work to reconnect folks with their needs, with their own basic needs. And I think that there is a real connection between needs and boundaries, right? What we need out of relationships, what we need out of emotional connection, what we need out of our professional roles, right? There feels like there's a balancing act there between the needs and the boundaries. Do you think that that's true?
I do think that that's true, because I think what's happening is we're setting the boundaries because we're trying to enable ourselves to meet. We have a need that has not been met in some way.
Yeah.
And boundaries can be, you can have emotional boundaries, you can have time boundaries, you can have financial boundaries, physical boundaries. There's all kinds of boundaries we can set. And I have needs in all of those areas, and how I spend my money, when I spend my money, and having conversations with my husband about that. And we sort of set boundaries for ourselves around those things. My physical boundaries, I've become much more of a handshaker than a hugger when I first meet people now. It's just different. Things have changed. My emotional boundaries, I have a hard stop on how much I can give in certain situations, and then I have to go replenish. So there's different needs that we can have, but I think you're onto something. I know you're definitely onto something here with connecting a person connecting their needs with the act of setting some sort of boundary, and how those two things are directly connected. I mean, I know in coaching, most of the coaching work we do is about things at work, although we do talk about personal things because we're a whole person, right? And the idea of identifying what we want can be really tough for a lot of people. Certainly it has been for me. There are some situations I'm very clear on what I want. Other situations I'm like a deer in headlights. And I think it's, for me, I can say because, maybe I haven't stopped to think about it, or maybe because, like you said, I don't know that my needs or my desires matter. I too would probably look at, what is it you're trying to get? What are you trying to get by holding this boundary? What is it you think having this boundary is going to give you? What are you trying to achieve by this? So I look at it through that lens, and that usually helps identify a need or a desire that's not being met. And oftentimes those needs and desires are just, I want to feel a certain way, or I want to stop feeling a certain way.
Yeah.
Right?
Or I don't want to be made to feel a certain way.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't want to be made to feel a certain way. I know tactically, time boundaries are a thing at work. And setting boundaries, you said something about relationships, so I want to dig into that a little bit. When we set boundaries with people at work, I don't have time to fulfill your request right now, Wendy. This is my day to not take any meetings. This is how I run my day. But then there's pressure from the other side. And then you feel the guilt, like you said, like, oh, I should be a better team player. I should be more collaborative. I'm going to sacrifice my relationship with this person, et cetera. And then we give in.
And something that's so important, Zovig, there, right? So when that moment, when you recognize, oh, I'm gonna give in, I'm gonna, and what's happening there? I'm gonna break my own boundary and give in and do this thing that's being requested of me because of the emotional or whatever kind of pressure that I'm feeling in this situation. Think about this, right? So in that moment, where are the scales of empathy, right?
Okay.
I am, in that moment, I am over empathizing with the other person, and I am under empathizing with myself.
That's a really good way to put it. And my intuition is to go to, how much responsibility are you taking for them over yourself?
Yes.
And I know responsibility and empathy are different. They're related, but can be related, but different. But I like the way you phrase the empathy. I'm over empathizing with them and under empathizing, or maybe not at all empathizing with myself.
And that's what we do so often, right? We completely suppress that part of ourselves that is actually trying to pipe up and say, no, don't, like, hold the line.
Yeah.
Don't give in.
And I'm going to ask you a really big question, and again, make it smaller if you need to, but why do you think we suppress and over empathize with the other, as opposed to, I see it as a choice. I'm going to over empathize with you in this moment because it's more important for you than it is for me to do this. But this time I'm actually going to over empathize with myself, but this time, and make different choices every time, because I don't think anything has to be one way all the time. I think we really back ourselves into a corner, but we forget that we have choice. I'm wondering why, like, from your perspective, why do you think we under empathize with ourselves?
this is always the moment when I'm working with someone and these kinds of things come up and we realize, oh, have you maybe considered there's a pattern of under empathizing with yourself? And then the question that always comes up next is, where did you learn to do that? And I love that I love the empowerment that comes with the reality of choice, but we have to temper it with the reality of neurodevelopment and of patterned repetition and of having learned to suppress those pieces, usually from a long, long time ago, right? So folks who really struggle with this, who really over empathize with others and under empathize with themselves, usually doesn't take long to go back and find a pattern of relationships in their life where their needs were often secondary to someone else's, where they might have learned to suppress their emotions and just make everything okay. Now, the good news, right, is that, as you say, we can make different choices, but in order to make those choices really effectively, we have to recognize the behavior patterns that exist.
Yeah.
So we look at those patterns and then we start to question them, and then we can make really valuable choices.
Asking the question, when did that start? Or
how did you learn? Where did you learn that?
Yeah, that's a question I use a lot in coaching too. Where did you learn this? And I also add in, and how do you know this to be true? Those are two really good questions to ask. But this reminds me of something that I learned in some of my coach training. So we learned there's a point of origin for some of this behavior, right? Like it started somewhere, and probably for good reason, because it was a safety mechanism. It was a coping mechanism. It was a thing that made life easier, and it worked. It served its purpose. And at a certain point, those behaviors in our lives as grownups no longer serve. They start to work against us. And a coach that I trained under and studied under has this phrase: you are solving a problem that no longer exists.
Yeah.
And I love that phrase because I think every one of us can relate to it. It sort of forces us to go, oh yeah, that person is no longer here in my present. Oh yeah, that former boss I had who was demoralizing to me, no longer here, but I'm still acting like it.
Yeah.
I'm still behaving as if the problem is in my present when it's actually back there. And it can be a little jarring for someone to think about that and go, oh yeah, I'm totally spending my time and energy solving a problem that I don't even have anymore.
But I love that the way that you're piecing that together, because let's think about then what happens in practice, right? So someone, like, and going back to the time boundary, right? So this is maybe somebody that we're working for, or that we did work for, who used to breach that boundary all the time, who used to put those requests on us all the time, who always used to make us feel lesser than because of invading into that space. But then that person leaves and there is someone else there. And maybe with that other person, the first time they ask, you could simply say, do you know, Tuesdays are my admin days that I don't do virtual meetings, or whatever the thing is, right? And that person might quite open-heartedly say, I didn't realize. Thanks for letting me know. Let's book for another day. But that person's pattern has become accustomed to over empathizing with whoever's in that position, whoever represents or symbolizes that role, right? And we can see how this then gets writ large culturally, right? Like, so it's, one manager makes you feel this way, all managers must make you feel this way. And then it just goes on and on.
Yeah. You said culturally, and I want to talk about that because I think there are expectations that are both spoken and unspoken about being nice, about being helpful. At work, it's about being a team player. It's about caring about others. I feel like we can weaponize the word empathy sometimes and compassion sometimes, in our effort to be better people. Those words can be dangerous if not wielded with responsibility and discernment. And so I see this happen in my work a lot. I have certainly experienced this myself in my life, where it's like, I don't want to say no because then I don't want to upset them. I don't want to look like I'm a bad person. I don't want to look like I'm a bad team player if it's at work. I don't want to be thought of in a certain way. So it's a protective measure. Mm-hmm. This is one of the reasons we can sort of breach our own boundaries or allow them to be breached. There's a fear or a concern about the perception of who we are and whether or not we are good, or about whether or not we are about who we are, essentially, mm-hmm. for a good person or mm-hmm. a bad person. Mm-hmm. And I think I felt that most often when I was working in corporate America, especially because I was in sales and marketing. And so it was always say yes. It was always do anything you had to do. It was like, whatever you had to do to make the money, we did it. And I felt like my boundaries were being pushed up against and broken all the time. And I didn't know how to hold because the environment didn't allow for me to hold my own boundaries. It was expected to have no boundaries. And I work with some people in those kinds of environments. And I'm sure that those experiences happen in personal lives too, where like the environment you're in doesn't allow for you, or feels like it doesn't allow, or it might be dangerous for you to really hold your boundaries. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
I think that takes us to a really interesting place to think about the ways that boundaries are also flexible. And we can think about when and how we allow for that flexibility, that there are times and places when a flexible boundary is helpful, and there are times and places when a flexible boundary is actually harmful to self. Let's think about a really practical example, right? Have you ever, been in an extremely packed elevator?
Yes.
Yeah. Or a busy streetcar or subway car, right? When you are in those environments, your boundaries of personal space have to shift. And they don't feel like breaches of boundaries in that way because the context has changed. There was a social experiment that they did once where people were entering elevators. And this is one of those really fascinating things about humans, but we kind of have these weird unspoken rules about what you do in terms of how you behave when more and more people get in an elevator, mm-hmm. right? First person gets in, you stand in the center of the elevator. Someone else comes in, you move to one corner. Someone else comes in, they move to the other corner, and the third person's in the middle. Two more people come in, now we've got a little star, right? Like this plays out over and over and over again. And as it gets more and more jam-packed, all of a sudden people are touching, my shoulder might be touching someone else. Now, imagine how I would feel about my boundaries if I was in an elevator by myself and the next person who came in, who was by themselves, came up and stood with their shoulder pressing against my shoulder. I would look at them and say, what are you doing? Why are you in my space? Why have you breached my bubble, my boundary? But the context shifts those pieces. And I really like that example as a way to think about how fluidly we do shift some boundaries, right? Like through our day, through our relationship with one person versus another, right?
Yeah.
I have different intimacy boundaries with my husband than I do with my coworker, right? There's something here to think about. And I think what you're suggesting is that sometimes we walk into situations where we don't realize that context has fundamentally different boundaries or expectations of boundaries than we were anticipating walking into.
Right. Yes. And then we're at a choice point.
Yes.
Then we're at a choice point. I mean, you could presumably just not get on that elevator if it's getting too crowded for your taste. I've done that actually, where I'm like, you know what, it's not today. So I'm just going to get off and wait for the next one. Or I see it's too crowded and I won't. But as that example, if you extrapolate it out to other scenarios in life, you can make choices. Yeah. I think where we can get stuck sometimes in coaching is there's a story almost being like a conviction of the context gives me no choice. I have to stay in the elevator. I have to say yes when the request comes through because it's for so-and-so and I can't say no to so-and-so and I have no choice. And I fundamentally push against that as a coach and just in my life. Look, I came out why do we have to do that? Like I was born that way, right? And some of us are born with more of that than others. And I understand that. But I push back on that pretty hard because I think you can choose to stay in the crowded elevator and allow for that moment your boundary to be breached for a bigger purpose. You're in a hurry, you're trying to get somewhere, you can choose. And like you said, boundaries can be flexible, but the fact that we think that we have no choice, even when the choices aren't our preference, our options might not be our preference in the choice, but there are still choices. That's where coaching can get a little stuck in that conversation when someone is just convinced, no, that's not what we do here. It's not how it's done here. It's just not. I had a conversation with a group just a couple of weeks ago, and I said, is this something that you can do at your company? And they all shook their heads very vehemently, shook their heads like, no, we can't do that. And I thought, I bet you could. If someone were courageous enough to try.
Yeah.
And, but I think the other side of that choice, the uncomfortable choice, is the discomfort. The moment when you're the one in the back of the elevator and you realize I can't handle this anymore. So excuse me. And you're pushing your way out and making everybody uncomfortable to get out.
Yeah.
It's the same with saying no and holding a firm no, or holding a firm not right now, knowing that it's not what they usually do, but it's what I need. What do you think about that discomfort moment? What do you do in your work to support people in being in those uncomfortable moments of friction when they're trying to break that pattern of allowing their boundaries to be breached?
Well, what is coming up in that moment of friction is almost always the self that is being under-empathized with, saying, hello, like, I'm still here. What's happening? This is not okay, right? That discomfort is almost always coming from that core place of saying that this is not okay with me. This is now out of alignment with what feels good. And I think that some of the recent times that we've all come through culturally have maybe shifted some of those pieces. There were parts of the pandemic experience that helped people set boundaries in different kinds of ways than maybe they ever had before.
Yeah.
No, I'm actually not okay getting together with extended family this particular weekend of the lockdown. Or no, I'm not okay shaking hands right now. Things that were absolutely inside of broad cultural expectations, suddenly there were quite legitimate boundaries around. And then there's been a period in the aftermath of folks like resettling into like, where are you with things, right? I mean, I think about your example from earlier on where you were talking about like, I don't hug as much anymore. I shake hands, and may or may not have been a direct result of the pandemic, but like there's a lot of people who still don't even shake hands. So we see boundaries shifting like at such a multitude of different levels, right? There's personal boundaries, there's familial boundaries, there's institutional boundaries, there's cultural boundaries.
Yeah. So in the moment of discomfort, you're bringing them back to who they're over empathizing and under empathizing with to bring awareness. Where I might go in a moment like that, is I like to look at not necessarily what's getting in their way, but I'm trying to look at who will you become if you were to hold your boundary in this moment? Who's on the other side of the choice to say, thank you for the offer, but I'm going to stick with what I need right now.
Yeah.
Or I'm not going to do this right now. This doesn't work for me. Who can you become if you make a different choice and stop solving the problem that no longer exists? Because I find that, and this is actually a new sort of level of my coaching, is that I find that instead of spending too much time exploring the why behind the issue, that we look at what another coach I've studied under calls directionality. Where are you trying to go? I think that's one fundamental difference between therapy and coaching, is that we do look at where we're going. Like, we have a goal, some sort of goal, and that goal can be how I want to feel, how I want to behave, changing a behavior. And so we're always trying to advance in some direction towards something else, toward a different state of being. And so I will ask a client to go, if you did it, let's just pretend all circumstances worked out, no consequences, all was good. Who would you become if you did it this way instead?
I really like that frame, and it reminds me of I feel like it's related to a perspective shift that we often use too, which is asking the question, how does giving in on that boundary serve you? Right?
Yeah, that's a good one too, because they're getting something from it.
Yes, right. So how does letting your own boundary get breached serve you? There's usually something there. And then the accompanying question, what would it look like, or how would it serve you differently if you held the boundary?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good framing of the question too.
Mm-hmm.
Getting people to see the payoffs and the cost of their behavior,
Mm-hmm.
I know for me is really important, because there's a payoff and a cost to everything.
Absolutely.
Even the behaviors that work against us, there's a payoff there. Saying yes can keep you safe. It can make sure that a relationship stays harmonious. There's all kinds of payoffs to that. But the one big cost is that I can lose part of myself every time I say yes when I don't want to. Okay, I want to shift gears for a moment. I have another question. So, how do you think a person can start to recognize when they can choose to be flexible with their boundaries and when they should be holding their boundaries? Like, I know that if it's unfamiliar territory, you can kind of feel like a colt, like a baby colt. And your legs are just kind of going everywhere. And like, well, I guess I'll say yes here and no here. And you're not quite sure of what to say yes and to say no to, when and why. How can a person start to discern, this is a moment where I'm going to be flexible with my boundary, and it's for this reason and this reason, versus this is a moment where I'm not given anything?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that you've really sort of hit the heart of the work, right? And being able to do what you're suggesting necessitates that shift to seeing that boundaries live in me, right? My boundaries live in me. And so that means that I get to shift and move them. The greatest skill, I genuinely believe, that we teach, whether it's about boundary work or emotional regulation or reflecting on trauma responses and behavioral triggers, it's the skill of noticing. It's the skill of slowing down, being able to take a pause, a breath, a beat, to just, like, in my mind, I'm always thinking about like pausing the action and just for a nanosecond going, whoop, like, can I just come out of this for a second? Just looking, what's happening, right? And if you, that's the skill that, I mean, it takes time and practice, and without it, I think we are that baby colt who's just kind of, bucking against the intrusion. We have to be able to slow it down and then ask meaningful questions. The questions that we've already been talking about. Who am I worried about right now? Who am I thinking about? Is it the right person to be thinking about? Where are my values in alignment? Where's my level of discomfort? What are the things that are feeling, sticky and gross? And what are the things that are feeling positive and momentous? But we can't identify any of that if we can't slow it down enough to.
Yeah. The slowing down is so critical, Wendy.
Yeah.
It's so critical. And especially in today's world, I always feel funny when I say that phrase, but right now things are moving fast. And,
Yes.
in the professional world, companies are changing every day. There's layoffs all the time. They're changing direction. People's jobs change. And we're expected to respond. Like the people who respond the fastest and they create the results the quickest are the ones that are often rewarded. They're often seen as the head honchos, the real rock stars, if you will. And so there's a lot of pressure to move quickly. And if we could just take, like you said, even a nanosecond, I mean, I often say I'm like 30 seconds. Everyone has 30 seconds to just collect yourself and ask yourself some really key questions, like you said.
What is this?
Yeah, what is
What
this?
is happening? Why do I feel like this?
Right.
And it's those emotional flips that come up in us, right? It's the moments that we think, I'm really upset right now. Why? Like, what just happened? Or like, I'm suddenly really snippy. Questioning what just happened. Something came up in me that is indicating something's not sitting right. Something's being breached. What's happening?
Yeah.
Right. And then we get curious about it.
Yeah. I liked how you said, who am I worried about right now? Which is a version of who am I over empathizing with. But I like, who am I worried about right now? For me, that just made it so clear. Who am I worried about right now?
And here's a really important piece of this puzzle, right? And this goes back to something you were saying earlier. When we ask that question, who am I worried about right now? It is not always as simple as, am I worried about you or am I worried about me? There's a third piece in there. It's, am I worried about you? Am I worried about me? Or am I worried about what other people are going to think about me? So it's like, is it you? Is it me? Or is it this perception of me that I am protecting? And it's more important to protect me than it is to protect this perception of me. And that can be really scary.
Yeah.
And really difficult to embrace, right?
Some of the times that I've found myself most upset in my life have been when I thought that a person believed that I was not good.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I had a friendship end over something that I felt was just a ridiculous misunderstanding. And I really wanted to explain what happened and they wouldn't listen. And I was okay to let the friendship go. But what really got my goat was they think I did this on purpose.
Yeah.
They think I'm deceitful.
Yeah.
This feels hard. How dare they? I'm not that person. Like the perception management can be really strong. It can be very loud.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's think about this, right? If we agree that we're shifting the perspective on boundaries from it not being about how close we're going to let other people come to us, and instead we're going to think about how far am I going to go to protect my boundaries? What you've just identified is something that's really important, because sometimes what happens is that little part of us, when it's what we're protecting is the perception of us, oh, damn it, we'll go really far.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's harmful far.
Can be too far.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Let me pause here for a second. I want to think about what I want to ask you next. Oh, I know what I wanted to ask you. So sometimes in coaching, I talk about boundaries as more than just a yes or a no, or a sort of a thou shalt not pass moment, but a way of setting agreements. That it doesn't have to, because some people struggle with saying hard no's. And so I will often talk to them about thinking about boundaries as agreements. And agreements they look different for everything and everyone. Agreements can be, I want to do this for you. I cannot do this right now. Here is the time by which I can. Or I want to do this, but I don't want to do it this way. I'd like to do it this way instead. I like part of what you're saying, not all of what you're saying. Can we figure out a way? Right? There are ways, and sometimes the boundaries are a hard no, like this is just not, I won't do this. This is not part of my world, my life. But I think that it's a spectrum, and learning. And again, all of it is choice. It comes back to choice. I think the foundation, at least from what I'm getting, Wendy, and you can add more to this, is who am I worrying about? Who am I over empathizing with? What are my needs? And what are my choices? Mm-hmm. And when I give myself the opportunity to choose, then I have more freedom, and I can say to you, here's how I would like to do it. Can we find a meet in the middle? Can we find a tightrope walk where it's sometimes you and it's sometimes me? Can we change the timing? Can we whatever it is, right? There's the sort of the landscape of options opens up if we can think about boundaries not as just a hard no, but that there are many versions of what a boundary could look like, where I'm not left feeling resentful or like I've given up a piece of myself, or we both can win in some way. Mm-hmm. What do you think of that? The idea of thinking of them as agreements?
Mm-hmm. It feels very much to me like what you are talking about is the ideal sort of scenario, which is we have two mature folks who are aware of where their lines and values are, who are coming together to say, you know, these are the things beyond which I absolutely cannot agree, and these are the places that I'm willing to pull back a little bit and be flexible, right? And so, I mean, I keep imagining like this, like a fence that you can literally like move depending on the conversation, the task, the relationship that you're having, right?
Yeah.
In this context here and now, this is what I'm okay with. In that context back then, it was not okay. I mean, but again, what you're really talking about there is a whole lot of transparency.
Yes.
And maturity.
And presence.
And people who are able to slow it down enough. Yeah. When so often the reality of what's happening is a whole bunch of the colts, yeah. Running around in a paddock, yeah. Banging their feet through fences.
Yeah, the way you said that, as soon as you said mature adults, I thought, I know where she's going. Because that is the ideal scenario. And it does assume that each of us has slowed down enough to recognize our needs, to maybe identify if we are trying to manage our perception, or if we're trying to manage ourselves. Is this a problem that no longer exists that I'm trying to solve? All those things that we've already talked about, getting present and aware of all of those so that you can say, here's how I'd like this to go instead.
Mm-hmm. What I'm suddenly thinking of, though, too, is, and I think that this is maybe an important like takeaway, is just this concept, though, that even if I am not interacting with someone who's bringing the same to me that I am bringing to them, the awareness that I hold that I am bringing that I am attempting to come to this boundary setting with grace and transparency, it then gives me the peace, the space to recognize. So I'm okay with that if they don't.
Yeah.
If they think I'm a bad person because I'm not willing to bend on that, so be it.
Yeah.
Like I'm okay with that. And again, that can be a really hard thing to do, but it's harder when you don't have the awareness.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really accepting ourselves for who we are and feeling comfortable with that, so that when someone disagrees with us or has a different perspective on who we are, we can live with that and know that it is not the truth for us. Mm-hmm. And maybe have compassion for how they might be responding to us. And, with that friend situation that I described, I mean, it took me like 6 months to get past the offense of me being seen as a bad person and just realize, I'm not. It was a misunderstanding. I wish it could have been different. It's not for a reason. Mm-hmm. And perhaps that was a friendship that just needed to end.
And I can't control what that person is going to think and feel about me.
And I can't control.
Yeah.
That is a really good place for us to pause. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the mic drop moment, because I think that really is so important, that we cannot control how other people see us, feel about us, think of us.
And it brings us right back to the beginning to say it's why it's so important that we recast boundaries as living with us. Mm. They are not things that we put out into the world and wait for people to cross. They are things we carry. We get to hold them. We wield them. They're ours.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Wendy. This was a pleasure. And I look forward to doing more of these sort of coaching therapy explorations around some of these topics. So I appreciate you for this. And I will include in our show notes ways to find out more about who you are and where you are if people want to get in touch. So thank you.
Always a pleasure. Love talking to you and love talking about boundaries.
So thank you so much to everybody who is listening, and we'll be back in another couple of weeks. Until then, take care of yourself. Lots of love and big energy, and see you all soon.